Welcome to the Nonfiction Writers Podcasting in a Great Way. I'm Ryan Aber. Jason Kersey will join us later, but right now we have a special guest from West Virginia, the West Virginia radio analyst Dwight Wallace. Dwight, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Doing great. Just getting ready to head out to Morgantown for my first time. Jason's been there, but really looking forward to being in West Virginia for the first time ever.
Well, it's a little different. You'll find the landscape will look a little different to you, I think, coming in. But we're happy to have you. We're very excited about being a part of the Big 12, and this is our third time around, and so we're starting to get to know some of you folks, and it's exciting for us. So these are always exciting, the Big 12 games.
Yeah, I know. Jason has said wonderful things about Morgantown and West Virginia campus specifically. Barry Trammell, our columnist, has been out there and developed a really close friendship with Jonathan Kimball, the Mountaineer from last year. So I'm really looking forward to being out there for the first time.
Well, welcome. We're glad to have you.
I appreciate it. I obviously wanted to talk to you about this game Saturday, and yesterday when we were talking to OU coaches and players, the constant theme throughout the day was 2012 and the wild night out there. What are some of the biggest things that stand out to you looking back on that game?
Well, of course, that was Tavon Austin's night, wasn't it? That's the one.
Oh yeah.
If you remember that name, I don't know. You may have forgotten that name.
I don't think anybody in Oklahoma will be forgetting that name anytime soon.
Well, that was a shocker to all of us. You have to give total credit of that to the coaches. Coach Holgerson just on a whim, I guess, he decided let's stick Tavon at the single back and let's see if we can find a way to get him to the second level. Then it's up to him. And of course, he's pretty tough when you get him to the second level, and he just had a huge night. But we don't have Tavon anymore, so that makes us a little more nervous for us on this end.
Yeah, I know. Bob Stoops and Mike Stoops and the rest of the OU defensive coaching staff, especially, are glad for that. And you mentioned Tavon Austin. Obviously, he's the takeaway from that on the West Virginia side, but Stedman Bailey's game gets sort of forgotten in that the wash of the aftermath of that game, that he put up, I think it was 206 yards of receiving, and just a phenomenal game that would have been the best performance in the Big 12 most weeks if it weren't for what Landry Jones was doing on one side and obviously what Tavon Austin was doing on the other.
Well, that's true, and Stedman was a good football player for us. He tended to be the big play guy. I mean, he was the one. Tavon, we'd get him the ball a lot of times, and some of those he'd break for big plays because he was so talented. But a lot of times we were taking a shot down the field to Stedman, and he was making some unbelievable catch in the back of the end zone some way. And so you're exactly right. He did get a little bit overshadowed, I think. And, he did have another year or two. We were kind of keep our fingers crossed maybe he would have come back for a year, but that didn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking a little bit at this game, and obviously last year's game was so different from the 2012 game, the one in Norman that was a low-scoring game. But how does West Virginia's offense compare to that one of a couple years ago and even last year?
Well, really different. Although we've gotten a real shot in the arm from Clint Trickett. I think, one thing, you've got Coach Holgerson with a very creative mind and a lot of good ideas, and then you've got this group of players over here, but somehow you've got to have that conduit, and that's always the quarterback in his offense. And, we struggled last year because we just didn't have that. We didn't have that connection between Coach Holgerson's sideline calls and what made it into the huddle, and then the execution. So I think that's the key, and that's where Clint Trickett has been a real important guy for us this year. Is he's been the guy that just is settled in. He feels comfortable. All of a sudden, those signals from the sideline and communications from the sideline are not cumbersome like they were a year ago. He really struggled and was having to kind of read between the lines and figure things out. Now it's second nature. So I think that's helpful, number one, gives him a lot of confidence. And then plus he's healthy too. He got banged up last year and was struggling with his shoulder, and that's been healthy and doing fine so far. So he's throwing the ball stronger. He's throwing it better. He's showing just great accuracy, and he's in very good decision making. So right now, you look at our offense, and just an awful lot of that hangs on the quarterback position and how well he does.
Absolutely, and OU fans have seen what Clint Trickett can do. He came in a few years ago for Florida State when OU was playing them. E.J. Manuel got hurt, and Clint Trickett dang near led him to a comeback win over the Sooners. So he's had some success against Oklahoma in the past.
Well, he's a competitor. It was exciting to watch his play in Oklahoma, in the Alabama game, the first game. And because you just don't know. We knew that he'd improved in the off season. You see him in spring practice. You see him working hard in the weight room and those kinds of things. But when you put him on the field against Alabama, at that time the number 2 ranked team, and boy, he just went out there full of confidence and got off to a fast start. And I think if we'd have hadn't dropped so many balls, we had a few drops in there at key times that kind of hurt us. But without those, we might have been able to pull that one off. Even he played that well.
How big of an eye opener was that Alabama game? I think for a lot of us that follow the league and follow West Virginia from afar, this was thought of. Dana Holgerson's on the hot seat. He's really got to make a turn. Didn't think that game would be competitive at all, and then for it to be that close late and West Virginia to have a chance to win, like you said, maybe could have won without some of those drops and just minor things that happened. But how big of an eye-opener was that for people following the team and also for the team themselves that they can hang with a pretty good team?
Well, I think for our fan base it was a big eye-opener because I think there was a lot of apprehension going into this season, just not knowing. We had struggled last year, and we had inconsistency at quarterback. We had so we struggled defensively. We just had a lot of problems, and so I think going into this year, there are just a lot of question marks, and really the quarterback thing was not settled. I mean, finally, at some point in the spring, Coach Holgerson said, "Well, Clint Trickett's going to be the guy." And that was it. But I don't know that at that time if anyone felt there was a huge division between the quarterbacks, and they just accepted the fact that he'd get the first shot at it and he would be the guy initially. So, but when we went to Alabama, you kind of had the feeling that the team went in with pretty good confidence. I think they liked the way the two-a-day practices went. I think this team is closer than that group was last year. And also, I think they've grown to really have a lot of confidence in Clint. So we've got a couple of receivers that are making catches, and they're threats on the outside. We've got a solid group of running backs that we can kind of plug any of 5 in there, really. And so I think there's just a lot of things happening in there that kind of gives you confidence. And so I think team-wise on the inside, I don't know that was a huge surprise, but to the fan base, I think it was a big surprise.
Absolutely, and you mentioned the wide receivers, and Kevin White's name was the one that got brought up a ton yesterday by a couple OU defensive players and Coach Bob Stoops. Just talk a little bit more about not only White, but some of those other receivers who can make plays downfield for Clint Trickett.
Yeah, well, there's several there. And of course, with the spread offense, you're going to see a bunch of them. And part of that I thought hurt us in the Alabama game because it was the guys down the line that dropped the passes. It wasn't the starters.
Yeah.
We were 3 or 4 deep, fine, but when you get to 6, 7, and 8, those are the guys that drop passes against Alabama that you wonder, but you need the depth. If you're going to play the spread, you've got to do those things. And but, yeah, Kevin White, of course, he's 6'3", 215 pounds or so he's a tall, strong guy. He's a good leaper. And he's made a bunch of those over-the-head catches and back-of-the-end zone catches and fades. And so he's been able to use his physical talent. But he's a guy, he can run too, so he can get open. And then on the other side's Mario Alford, and he's the guy with the sprint speed. He was the Georgia State sprint champion, so he's a guy that they'll take a couple of shots downfield during the game too also. And so those guys are very capable. You get Da'Keil Shorts, you get some other guys in the slot working in there, and it's a pretty good mix. I think they've got some little quick guys. Thompson is another one of those little water bug kind of guys. And then you got some tight end types also that work into there. So I think it kind of helps them offensively, what they're trying to do, tied in with that, how they complement it with the personnel.
And then on the other side, some big news yesterday that Daryl Worley, the starting cornerback, was suspended indefinitely, won't play this week. How big of a loss for that is that in the secondary for the Mountaineers?
I think it's pretty big. He's the guy that was on Cooper from Alabama. So much Alabama would load up trips, tight end trips, sometimes on a wing, sometimes flanker, and then a single receiver backside. And, of course, they like to go back there. And if you load up to the formation defensively, which you kind of have to do with their run game, then you've got one guy. Well, that was Worley back there one-on-one with that split receiver. So I think that's a big loss. That's a guy that's played very well for us. He's also been involved in kickoff returns, and he's a pretty good athlete. That's a big loss for us.
Yeah, it seems like, especially with what OU has done with Sterling Shepard and moving him outside and the success he's been able to have, you would have thought that it would have been a good matchup there with Shepard and Worley, and obviously that won't happen now.
Yeah, I would guess you're right.
And then what about West Virginia's front seven? OU will be without its number one tailback right now, Keith Ford, although they've used a three-man committee, but certainly they want to be able to establish themselves on the ground with Alex Ross and Samaje Perine. What does the Mountaineer front seven look like?
Well, I think fast, mostly. I think they're built a little bit more for speed. Reasonable size, but not huge. And so I think that's always one of the concerns is how do you stand up with the run. So I think, they're playing that 3-5 most of the time, and they're trying to bring folks from different places and to try to offset some of that. But a year ago, we were a little bit more stout, I think, inside. And this year, younger people and having to maybe blitz a little more, try to bring different kinds of pressure to hold our own in there.
Absolutely, and a lot of OU fans before this season, and sort of alluded to this earlier, talking about the unexpected way that West Virginia started this season with the game against Alabama. But I think a lot of OU fans thought that this game would be one that just sort of a little tune-up before they get to TCU and Texas in the next few weeks, getting right into the meat of the Big 12. But right now, this looks like a team that has a chance to push the Sooners a little bit in a way that they haven't been pushed. What that we haven't talked about does West Virginia need to do in order to pull off this upset Saturday night?
Well, I like always, you have to avoid the errors. I mean, you've got the checklist of things that in order to win, there are certain things that you have to do, and you can't turn the ball over, and you got to be solid in the kicking game, and no missed assignments, and then all those kinds of things. But I think getting off to a good early start would be important, I think, to the Mountaineers, especially being home. I think getting the crowd into it and kind of get Trickett, get him cooking there a little bit, getting those receivers handling the ball some, and seeing if we can move the ball early would be very helpful. And then, of course, always a stop or two in there on the defensive side helps a ton. But that's been something until last week that we have not done a very good job of. But last week we actually had 10 straight third down failures at the end of that game by Maryland. So we kind of got a little bit excited thinking, wow, maybe the defense is coming along a little bit.
Yeah, it'll definitely be a test for both sides on Saturday night. You mentioned the crowd and how rowdy it can be there in West Virginia, especially a night game. A couple OU players had some things to say yesterday. I don't know if you heard what they had to say, but I think a lot of people forget that even that West Virginia trip in 2012, there was maybe a less than full student section because it was during Thanksgiving break, and that's not going to be the case Saturday night. I know Morgantown's going to be really rocking for this one.
Well, they like their football here, just like I've been to Oklahoma a number of times for those big games, so it won't be unfamiliar to you guys at all. But yeah, our people do like it. They'll be excited to have Oklahoma there. We're still, I think, a little bit giddy over being part of the Big 12 and kind of being in this thing, in a conference with Oklahoma and others. And so to have you come to town is exciting enough, but being night and in Morgantown, that makes it even special.
And what's it been like for you just overall in the first couple of years of the Big 12? Obviously, West Virginia's sort of off on an island there, especially when you think about all the Oklahoma and Texas teams in the league. But what do you think about West Virginia's spot in the Big 12, and just what's the experience been like for you to begin with?
Well, it's been all positive. I think, first of all, just to be wanted, if you're West Virginia, we've been kicked around a little bit over here. We got kicked around by the ACC, kicked around by the Big Ten. To tell you the truth, we carried the Big East for a lot of years in there, but I don't know that we were a favorite of the Big East even. So, just to be wanted, I think that's been important. And the Big 12, they've showed us that they did want us, and they've welcomed us into their stadiums, and so it means a lot, I think, to the West Virginia fan base, because they're proud of their football and they're proud of their university, and to be included in the Big 12 is just a terrific thing, I think. So I know they really want to represent the Big 12 when we play non-conference games. They want to represent them well, and they want to be one of the better teams in the Big 12. So that's the goal, is to try to get to where you guys are right now.
Well, they've certainly done it well so far this season with the tight game against Alabama, the win over Maryland last week on the road in a game that they had gotten blown out last year. Certainly it looks like West Virginia has a chance to be one of the teams near the top in the league this year.
Well, we'll hope so. We got a few things to fix yet, but I think we're on the way. So, yeah, we're excited about it.
Well, all right, Dwight. Well, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time and joining us, and I know Jason and I are really looking forward to being in Morgantown Saturday night for what should be a really good game.
That sounds great. Look forward to it.
Thank you so much to Dwight Wallace of West Virginia Radio for joining us now, joined by Jason Kersey. Jason, I understand you just got a chance to talk to Clint Trickett.
Yeah, I wanted to be on the interview with Dwight, but they had a conference call set up for out-of-town media to talk to Clint Trickett, and it happened to come about right at the same time as we were about to start talking to Dwight, so I had to step off of that. But yeah, I got a chance to talk to Clint and ask him, one thing I think is interesting, I'm going to be writing about this later this week, is that he's got experience against OU when he was at Florida State during that big top 5 matchup in 2011. And he kind of got thrown into the fire in the third quarter when E.J. Manuel went down. And, he said that was kind of his introduction to big-time college football. And so he's certainly grown a lot since then, and we all know how well he's done so far this year.
And when we were talking to Dwight, one of the things that we talked about was that West Virginia really didn't have a settled quarterback situation entering this year. They thought had gone back and forth, and it wasn't really sure until right before the season that Clint Trickett was going to be the guy, and obviously he's done really well in wins over Alabama and Maryland last week, or not a win, a near loss to Alabama. It feels like a win, the talk around it, but just what do you think has been the difference in Clint Trickett from last year when he was sort of went in and out of the lineup and Millard was starting a lot to this year?
I think a lot of the graduate transfer quarterbacks haven't done well. I mean, really, if you look through, Russell Wilson did well, but he's a Super Bowl winning quarterback. But I mean, Drew Allen and some of these other guys that have tried, Kendall Thompson, that have tried to go do this, haven't been successful. And I think it's tough to just go into a whole new system when you've worked in one for a while and you want to transfer. These guys don't typically succeed that much when they're quarterbacks, and so maybe it just took him a year. He graduated from Florida State quick, so he went in with a couple years to go at West Virginia. So I think maybe just needing a year in the system probably is what it was.
Absolutely, and we'd also talked about with Dwight the atmosphere in Morgantown on Saturday night is going to be pretty strong. The last time there, the students weren't all on campus, and it wasn't quite as rowdy. But even with that, OU players yesterday had a lot to say about what it was like playing in Morgantown in 2012. You were at that game. What do you remember from the atmosphere around it? Obviously, everybody remembers the craziness on the field, but what about the other stuff?
It was awesome. Like, I'm so excited to go back to Morgantown, and I've told you this a million times. Like, I am so excited to go back. It was such a neat place, so different than anything else you see in the Big 12. The fans are crazy. The thing I'll always remember about that trip, other than Tavon Austin, is walking around with the mayor of Morgantown before the game. I had interviewed him for a story that week, and he called me, just randomly called me when we were on our way to Morgantown for the game to say, "Hey, I'll show you around if you want. I'd love to meet you in person." So once I got to the game, I met up with him outside the stadium, and he walked me around the tailgating, and it was just wild. It was all everybody sort of, at OU the tailgating is sort of a little bit more spread out. At Morgantown, it's all in one little area, or most of it is, and it's just crazy. One of my favorite memories of that is walking with him through this group, and you could smell a certain illegal substance that isn't illegal in all states now, if that tells you anything. And he turned around to me and just said, "By the way, we haven't legalized that." And I thought that was really funny. He's just walking me through, introducing me to people. He was trying to find the governor of West Virginia to introduce me to the governor, but the governor wasn't there apparently, or wasn't around. It was a lot of fun. It was actually me and Eric Bailey from the Tulsa World that were getting shown around by the mayor of Morgantown. It was a blast, and I know that guy's not the mayor anymore, but I'll bet he still lives there. We're gonna have to give him a call.
Absolutely, it'll be a fun weekend. I'm really looking forward to my first trip there. But yesterday, a lot of what the players said, Chuka Ndulue and Deron Neal especially, sort of got some reaction from people in Morgantown and West Virginia because of the words. Rude was one of them, and but even talking to those guys and hearing the words that Chuka said and the way he said it, I think it was clear that it was a respect thing. It wasn't about tearing down what West Virginia fans were like. It was just they're rude, and that's just how they are, and let's have fun with it.
Yeah, I didn't take that. I think that's sort of a semantics thing. When the people who got upset weren't there to hear the way he said it and the context in which he said it, So yeah. I think calling a fan base rude is usually not a bad thing. They're saying that they're good fans. They get in your head. They clearly got in their head if they're still talking about it 2 years later. And that's the same thing we hear about Texas Tech fans. I know a lot of people, criticize them or whatever, but you can't deny that they're getting in people's heads. I remember walking around 2 years ago. I'm gonna go back to Lubbock this year, walking around with some people and hearing the way that those students were screaming at the OU players, and they were, and I think it was working. OU won that game convincingly, but here's the thing, and here's the other reason why it probably stands out to OU players. OU doesn't have fans quite like that. And I'm not saying that to criticize the OU fans, but we all know how apathetic the student section looks a lot of times, unless Stoops calls them out early in the week. They seem pretty apathetic for the most part, and so sure, that stuff's going to stand out to these players.
Absolutely, and sort of go back to that in reviewing the last game. You haven't seen the student section really packed and rocking much the last few years, except when, like you said, Bob Stoops or somebody else has called them out. But there was no calling out last week. But the student section for Tennessee was loud and full.
Yeah, they showed up for that game. I was impressed. That's the earliest I've ever seen the student section filled up, I think, since I've been on the beat. So this is my third season. and I also grew up going to OU games, and so it certainly seemed different. So I mean, maybe they've turned a corner. I don't know. It was a big name out of conference opponent. And maybe that had something to do with it.
Yeah, but it wasn't the buildup of like Notre Dame 2 years ago or anything like that. So it was a little bit surprising how full it was and just how they were on Saturday night.
Yeah, it was.
And also in that game, what was the one thing that really stood out to you in the 34-10 win over the Volunteers?
Oh, a bunch of things. I think that the running backs were again impressive. Samaje Perine, I think, is really going to be good. I think he should start and be the main guy this weekend in Morgantown. I know Stoops said Alex Ross is going to start. I still think Perine will be the main guy, just based on what we've seen. Alex Ross does some things really well. He's really fast, but I think they had clearly sort of started to separate themselves into 1, 2, and 3. At least last week.
And I think Alex Ross is, and I think I wrote this in Monday's thing, he sort of seems to be a boom or bust guy where he's either going to break through and get you a lot of yards in a big chunk, or he's not going to get you much of anything at all. And Samaje just has that power, doesn't shy away from contact. Matter of fact, most of the time he seeks it. Mm-hmm. And can really get in there and just push the ball forward.
Yeah, and that's why I think he's going to be the guy this weekend with Keith Ford out, which is too bad. You never want to see that happen. Sounds like he's going to be okay, though, in the long run. And I don't think that they're necessarily going to really, really need him. In fact, a guy like Samaje may be really good to have because if this thing turns into a shootout, which it could, it'd be good to have a grind-it-out kind of running back in there.
Absolutely, and you mentioned Keith Ford was having a really good game Saturday against Tennessee, even with the rotation, was getting a lot of carries. Once again, getting thrown to a lot. That touchdown, his touchdown reception that he had was just amazing how wide open it was after the wide receiver cut in, and I believe the guy that was covering him might have slipped a little bit, but he really had wide open space. Had to have a safety come over to have any chance, and he didn't beat him to the end zone. But what Keith Ford gives him in not only the running game, but able to use him in the passing game as well is just so different from what we've seen even last year with those three guys.
Yeah, I mean, Brennan Clay was decent out of the backfield catching the ball, but nobody's been able to do it the way that Keith Ford has.
Absolutely, and on the defensive side, we saw the secondary had a really good game against Tennessee, at least the starters, the three main ones. Julian Wilson had a fantastic game all around, even taking away the 100-yard interception return for a touchdown. You had Quentin Hayes just making plays right and left, especially the big hit early on Worley, Tennessee's Worley, not West Virginia's Worley, that knocked the ball loose, and he was able to recover that. And then, of course, Zach Sanchez coming up with the big interception to continue his streak at 4. I think Ahmad Thomas has some improvements to make at the other safety spot, but for what we perceived as a weakness of this defense coming into the season, the back end of it looks really good right now.
Yeah, they do. Julian Wilson's transition to corner has been really impressive, especially since he hadn't played the position at all in college and didn't go through spring practices. I thought that was I think that's been really, really impressive. Ahmad Thomas is the guy, I think, like you said, that needs to get better, needs to improve, because I think Stephen Parker is probably right there on his tail. Hatari Bird he's just not, even when he's in, it seems like he makes mistakes, and I'm really surprised by that. That was the guy I thought was going to start last year as a true freshman.
Yeah, and you can see the raw talent at times when he makes plays. He made a special teams play the other night, forced a fumble.
Yeah,
didn't wind up getting it back, but just you can see things in him that make you see why he was getting talked up so much when he signed. But yeah, it hasn't really clicked together for him yet.
And he's still young. I mean, There's still time. I just feel like OU should have redshirted him. I think he's a guy that should have been redshirted. I'm really surprised that he didn't.
Yeah, that's probably true. Last thing about last week before we jump to the West Virginia game a little bit more, but big recruiting weekend, and I wrote about this right before the game, but OU typically early in the season doesn't get a lot of commitments because of their reputation for not pressing guys to make decisions early. And Bob Stoops talked about that a little bit last week, that he gave him a hard sell, but it wasn't a hard sell maybe in the sense of some other schools. But I think a lot of us thought that Jamal Danley would commit, the junior college lineman, but to get Will Sunderland to commit early on Saturday, well before the game, I think was a big boost for an already huge recruiting weekend.
Yeah, it was. And that's sort of one I think we all saw coming, that he was going to commit eventually. It was just sort of a matter of when. But yeah, good for OU to get him now and go ahead and get that out of the way. I part of me sort of expected them to get more commitments, but again, like you said, I mean, that's just not their style to do the extremely hard sell, the commit now or the offers off the table, stuff like that. They don't do that. So, and that's to their credit, I think. And the other thing is, you think back to last year, their big recruiting weekend was TCU, and that was in early October. And they didn't get, I don't know that they got any commitments out of that weekend, but I know Joe Mixon and Micaiah Quick were both there that weekend, and they both ended up committing. So I think that, sometimes it's good because they're good at making a good impression, and it's sort of a lasting one that even if they don't get the commitment, a lot of times they'll end up getting it anyway.
Yeah, I think that this recruiting weekend, even with the two guys that they've got right now, was obviously very good, but it could be looked at as really productive come February when you look back and see maybe a couple of the other guys that were there. They had some five-star guys. It might be even something that won't present itself for another year, because there were also some really good can't believe we're saying 2016 guys, talking about guys who are only 1 year away, but some really good 2016 guys, including a couple quarterbacks that were on campus Saturday. So this weekend I think is going to pay off down the road with more than just those two commitments.
For sure.
And going to this week, Jason, we talked with Dwight about the loss of Worley, the cornerback, and what that could mean for OU's passing game, especially Sterling Shepard. How big of a blow is that for the Mountaineers defense, do you think?
Well, it's huge because, it's not like West Virginia has a great defense anyway, and you take away, one of the best players. I've seen people on Twitter, smarter people than me, saying that he has first-round NFL talent. You take that away, and now that you're not going to have him to cover Sterling Shepard, that could be a problem. I mean, I think OU was going to score some points anyway, but now I think OU's in much better shape.
Absolutely, and then on the other side for OU, their defense last week, yet another really good performance from their ones when they were out there, but a different test now with Kevin White and the West Virginia receivers. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, that was I think this is going to be the biggest test to date for Zach Sanchez and Julian Wilson. It'll be interesting to see who winds up on White most of the time. But either way, even for the safeties, I think he's one of the best. He's proving to be one of the better receivers in the country, and so that's always a good test. And then when you have Trickett throwing the ball, and we all know what kind of season he's had, so it's gonna be a really good matchup, and it could very well end up being another shootout. And I got to say, I wouldn't mind that because the last one was awesome.
Absolutely, and Zach Sanchez, you mentioned. It was banged up last week, but was able to get an interception for his fourth consecutive week. Julian Wilson has been fantastic, but one of the reasons they moved Julian to cornerback was because of his size. What would you do with those two guys in regard to Kevin White?
Yeah, I mean, I think Julian is probably the better matchup, but I think Sanchez is the better cornerback. So, I mean, Wilson is better size-wise, so, I mean, I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, it'll be fun to see what OU's defense does, because we saw a couple years ago, and I know we've talked about this a ton, but this was sort of the impetus behind a lot of their defensive changes, and we've seen how well those have paid off for the last couple years. Obviously, this isn't a team with Tavon Austin and Stedman Bailey and all those playmakers that we saw in Morgantown, but still going to be a challenge in the way that they spread the field and do things. And I think with what OU is doing with Geno Grissom, what they're doing with Eric Stryker, just an interesting matchup when West Virginia's offense is on the field.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, this is what they made the changes for. Is this sort of offense, and especially, Morgantown. The trip to Morgantown last time was a huge part of why they made those changes, both in the coaching staff and in the scheme. And there's not very many people that are still from that defense that are still on the team. Julian Wilson's one of them.
And he played.
Yeah. He was playing linebacker, which is absurd. And Chuka Ndulue was on that team, and he was a big time contributor. But I'm trying to think. He might be the only guy who started that game and is going to start this game.
I believe so.
Yeah, because Wilson did not start that game. He went in, and obviously, but I don't.
Right, because they started Tom Wart and Corey Nelson at linebacker, and then soon abandoned any thought of a linebacker playing in that game.
Exactly.
So it'll be a fun one, Jason. We're really looking forward to it. That's all the time we have for today, but we're going to be back Thursday from Morgantown, or from Pittsburgh at least, for another episode, and that's when we'll give our predictions for the game. Should be a good week. Check us out every day on newsok.com and the Oklahoman for the best OU coverage anywhere.